Religion does not play a constitutive role, but of course the polis model can be transferred to groups centered around the organizing core of a religion. The community itself does not have to be static or oriented only towards its historical foundation. So it is not inherently conservative, but it is marked, as the Kantian British scholar Honora O'Neill says, by an insider ethic. It reflects on the values of its existing ethos in an internal hermeneutical understanding of ethics. This model is characterized by three core components that are held together in some balance at first, but eventually unhinged through their development after antiquity. The three tendencies that the German philosopher Ludwig Sieb identifies are a teleological system, a polis setting, and thirdly, the internal dimension of conscience. They were held in a productive tension in the antique era. First, the teleological order assumed that all its participants are directed towards inbuilt goals. The second aspect, corresponding to the polis setting, was the understanding of the human being as a zoon politikon. It introduced a historical consciousness arising from dealing with the contingencies of praxis and of diverse agents, requiring a prudential use of reason. So a historical consciousness clearly means you need to make concessions, you need to make adaptations because of different starting points. And that was already a part of antique consciousness. The third dimension is the internal dimension of reflection, which is specified further into the personal capability of conscience. It could still operate within an encompassing natural order and the parameters of the community in antiquity. However, it was already an achievement at that time to keep the three factors together because of the divergent dynamics of each. And modifications in one affected the connection with the others, such as a growing historical consciousness through getting to know new contexts would have an effect on how you would see the human person's internal capability of morality. It could lead to, well, relativization, or it could lead to having a stronger view of what the individual brings. So what were these new developments that affected each factor plus their connection with others? The first one is clearly the teleology, a natural teleology yielded to a mechanic, technological theory of development, and finally to evolution. So 17th century, 19th century. The historical experience, the second factor, of cultural contingency remains, but the limits of the polis are superseded. And thirdly, the autonomy of the individual runs counter to all three predetermined natural, legal, or rational orders. So that is Ludwig Sieb's analysis. So after these intellectual factors that held the nurturing polis together disintegrate, other motives which were also already present in antiquity and that were reinforced by biblical monotheism, such as inner freedom and also internal critique, reappear. And that was in a way mentioned in Jocelyn Cesary's quote of Tönnies with reference to Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. The community kind of gives place to society. which is a very different type of sociability. But I want to go to the other kind of pole first, to the individual, before I come to inner freedom, which is one of the factors which has also been promoted by religion. So, crucial changes occur, 4 key terms that we've already encountered. So the social bond of the polis model is replaced by the social contract. Virtues are replaced by legal rules. It creates a framework for individuals ex nihilo without social or historical links that are prior to the contract. It's the contract that is now seen as the origin of the social framework. Before the contract, there were only individuals. Yeah, there weren't communities or traditions. That is the kind of artificial, if you want, assumption of the contract model. It's Paul Ricoeur who points that out, especially. The second element, so not just does the social bond get replaced by the social contract, also the understanding of prudence and of rationality changes. So prudential decisions of practical wisdom, phronesis, become self-interested cleverness. Prudence gets a self-interested slant. Rational increasingly means purposive, instrumental reason, Verstand in Kant's term, or Zweckrationalität. So it's not reason as Vernunft, which is defined in Kant by its outreach towards the unconditioned. Its capacity to ask questions beyond the realm of what can be negotiated. So it asks for what is not at our disposition. That was a strong understanding of reason, but here rational is understood just as cognitive in the contract model. So this model therefore understands the social aspects of human life as a legal framework of strict reciprocity. I give so that you give, do this. However, it provides an important gain in freedom. The sphere of mere legality. Herbert Schnellbach, German philosopher, points that out especially. Namely, it's enough to keep to external rules. You don't have to give inner consent. And that counteracts a possible tyranny of values or virtues in communities where members also have to agree internally, not merely in their external behavior. So it really enables internal critique. It enables a new type of freedom. One has to admit that much. However, religion, of course, and also moral conscience are not required because you don't have an internal reflective dimension of the self. So it can be combined secondarily, of course, with prosperity religion and with also the concept of an electing and condemning God, but it's not constitutive. It doesn't need religion internally. I want to point out the consequences for the moral foundations of democracy with Jürgen Habermas's critical point. A strong warning is expressed by Jürgen Habermas, who regards the democratic bond as being under threat of corrosion by markets, assuming regulatory functions in domains of life that used to be held together by norms, in other words, by political means or through pre-political forms of communication. So in the community model, the polis, you have, of course, pre-political forms of communication, and in a pluralistic democracy, you have political means. And both get replaced by market mechanisms. He concludes an uncontrolled entgleisende modernization of society could undermine the form of solidarity on which the democratic state depends, even if it cannot enforce it. Then the constellation that Böckenförde has in mind would transpire, namely the transformation of the citizens of prosperous and peaceful liberal societies into isolated, self-interested monads who use their individual liberties exclusively against one another like weapons. So individual rights like weapons. I mean, that is really the very sad decline of something that was originally meant to be universal. But what about Böckenförde, his quote here, Böckenförde, who has been translated into Italian and into many languages, but not into English. So he was a constitutional lawyer and Supreme Court judge, and he had formulated the following paradox in 1964. The pacified secular state is reliant on normative presuppositions that it cannot itself guarantee. So you have two poles. On the one hand, you have the neutrality of the state, which was realized for reasons of principle, to protect the freedoms of religion and worldview. State neutrality and religious freedom are two sides of the same medal. And tomorrow, the Giuseppe Alberigo Senior Award will go to Freedom of Religion or Belief, an international law commentary by Helen Bielefeld, Nazir Ghanea, and Michael Wiener. So they are clearly on the side of that very precious good, the neutrality of the state. However, on the other hand, this act of respect for individual freedom is also a risk, because the state has made itself dependent on the vitality of the moral sources that feed or nurture its self-understandings in society. So civil society cannot be controlled. You just have the constitutive traditions, and if they decline, falter, or become fundamentalist or so, the state can't really replace them. So these are the so-called pre-political and also, of course, pre-contract foundations, and they have to deliver imaginative, symbolic, conceptual, and motivational resources that support the ability to live together. So the choice is between creating isolated, self-interested monads who use their individual liberties exclusively against one another like weapons, and an understanding of individual selfhood that includes a moral, not just a legal relationship to the other. And that's, I think, what the third model does develop, namely inner freedom, morality, and solidarity, a universalist approach. The Austrian philosopher Herta Navelucekal observes that in contemporary philosophical ethics, morality is increasingly replaced by the logics of contract. Yet, when the term autonomy is used to cover actions both from self-interest, as in contract, and from morality, the danger is that the moral subject is emptied. It means two opposite things at the same time. And this has consequences also for how faith traditions are seen. She points out, losing the inner dimension of morality out of sight results in an equal failure to illuminate the possible link between morality and religious faith. A self-sufficient social contract has no connection to religion. A different concept of agency, self-reflection, and freedom is needed. Autonomy, not primarily as choice, but as self-legislation that respects the other, even when they are unlovable, as Kant says, and that is solidaric with people oppressed and in need. If you look at his publication Eternal Peace, it is scathing on conquerors, and it establishes the right of what Hannah Arendt will call the right to go visit, because it allows cosmopolitan relationships to emerge far beyond natural historical communities. So there you have internal morality and universality at the same time. So what's the link to religion? An analysis of the goodwill and of our finitude shows that hope is central for agency. The question of meaning or happiness cannot be put off for Kant, and religion is located as responding to practical reason and its antinomy. It empowers the individual and is the only model that has an internal connection to religion. Historically, faith communities have displayed their capability for self-reflection and transformation through the ages. Katarina Lojikal points out that religious traditions can only persist through centuries if their believers manage over and over again to reinterpret the core convictions of their faith in a way that renders them accessible and convincing in view of their respective contemporary condition. So the fact that religions have been able to do that each time in new intellectual settings, they haven't merged. Yeah, the word religions are still there. They haven't just amalgamated, nor have they just disappeared. Some have disappeared, and one can ask why, but one should see that religions have had that potential. So my final part is which concept of religion and which concept of public reason should we choose from among the many concepts that are being put forward. So the contract approach does not need religion, and in Rawls's theory of justice, it hardly plays a role. However, in the context of pluralism as a lasting feature, Rawls discovers religions in Political Liberalism in 1992. So religions, philosophical and other worldviews are all comprehensive doctrines. His work has elements of all three frameworks. So comprehensive sounds like the polis model, but the difference is that between the different communities in modern society, there is no public exchange envisaged. There is only an exchange in the so-called non-public background culture. The term public, you'll see, is used differently by all three authors. In Theory of Justice, Rawls combines an anthropology of rational choice in the renewed contract model with the famous device of the veil of ignorance. And that secures impartiality, namely the alternative to self-centeredness, or the universalist deontological understanding of morality. And also in the difference principle, clearly, justice as being able to maximize the chances of the most disadvantaged clearly also has elements, is absolutely universalist. Yeah. So it's a mixed model. You can find elements of all three approaches. The key text that political scientists and theologians refer to is very often political liberalism, and that states that at most an overlapping consensus can be achieved. Overlapping can only be seen from above by an observer's view, otherwise you can't identify the areas of overlap. However, the reasons for having this position differ, and of course it only amounts to a minimalist agreement. From the many critiques that this is not sufficient or ambitious enough, I want to let the Chicago feminist theological ethicist Christina Traynor speak. She says, instead of a Venn diagram of two intersecting circles, the awareness of one's own standpoint has to be included in order to gain, quote, 3 dimensions rather than 2. The slightest difference in experience produces a complete reorientation of perspective, because we now see our common elements from entirely different angles. Each of us arrays and interprets them differently. So this is a feminist critique which takes context seriously and self-understandings. I think it shows that only by moving to the participant's perspective can the real, glittering pluralism be made visible. All the facets from different contexts matter when different players agree, for instance on the need for ecological protection. The second understanding of public reason is put forward by Habermas, and for him the contribution of religious traditions to re-energizing the social bond and a normative consciousness, which is being replaced by a logic of the market. So the contribution of these traditions lie in their heuristic and motivating capacities, which their world-disclosing language makes available. Quote, pure practical reason can no longer be so confident in its ability to counteract a modernization spinning out of control, armed solely with the insights of the theory of justice. The latter lacks the creativity of linguistic word disclosure that a normative consciousness afflicted with accelerating decline requires in order to regenerate itself. So it's clear that in our current challenges, all resources of meaning are needed, translations are possible, and comprehensive doctrines or traditions are not towers in the landscape like Bologna's impressive Torri Pendenti, the Asinelli and the Garisenda towers. We are all part of a forum. Yeah, we're not in some self-enclosed silos. That's his view. We can say more about his view of translation, and that's where the theological critique begins, but at least he certainly sees all these traditions as being needed in a translation between citizens. My third understanding of public comes from Paul Ricoeur. He sees religions as co-founders of the public sphere. They have a historical stake in it. He urges Christian and other communities to take up, quote, without any hang-ups, their part in this co-foundation in open competition with each other, with the other heterogeneous traditions, which themselves are reinvigorated and driven by their unkept promises. With this point, which the two other approaches do not consider, Ricoeur adds an internal perspective and motivation of believers. They owe it to their tradition to actualize its unspent potential today in dynamic and praxis-oriented ways. So, as a conclusion, should religions be seen as irritants, as counteragents, as monoliths, as go-between mediators, or as competitors for public reason? What is clear is that comprehensive doctrines or traditions, among them religions, are examples of the good only in a formal sense. It is a matter of moral examination whether they are good also in their content, or whether they are dismissive of other communities, coercive, or reductionist. Habermas has established three criteria for religious traditions: the ability and willingness to recognize the distinction between secular and religious authority, the ability and willingness to allow for the autonomy of the sciences and humanities, and the willingness to accept the existence of other religions. I think these 3 points are irrefutable, and one can of course argue that they have been achieved in the history of certainly the monotheisms, but of course they've also been betrayed, and certainly the Christian confessions, for different reasons, found it hard to accept human rights. Yeah, it took them a long time to accept that this is a necessary level. However, the secular side is equally afflicted with tendencies that need to be corrected. Above all, the reduction of morality to law, of the human capability for morality to self-interested, prudential caution, insisting on strict reciprocity. If one does that, one won't tend, for instance, a kind of advocatory or anticipatory hand towards the enemy. One will only do what is safe and what will be responded to. There won't be any risks taken in this type of attitude. I give so that you give, but there is no opening. So this is, I think, that point of reducing morality to law, which we need on another level, is one thing that has been noted by quite a number of social ethicists. So the symbolic worlds of the religions, the chain of memory that they give to their adherents, the backdrop of the cosmos or the universe created by God, have the potential to break up a security-driven, suspicious, and cynical view of the other. With a universal creator, of course, everybody is at the same level. Everybody is a creature and can't be kind of just put at a lower level than eye level. So to conclude, as Margit Eckert sums up Paul Ricoeur's conclusions of his reflections on a new ethos for Europe, religions can contribute from their own depth to the task of combining, quote, translation, exchange of cultural memory, and reconciliation as models of intercultural hermeneutics. By, quote, setting free the memory of the unkept promises of the past, they can motivate their members to engage in carrying forward the as yet incomplete future of the past. Thanks for your attention.